tonight. Hope you guys are having a good evening. Let's get to it. So last week in Jiu Jitsu, we were working on developing an offensive closed guard. We worked on two different techniques last week. We worked on first understanding how to control the guard, and then from there using our hip bump sweep and our cross collar choke. And then we talked a little bit about how we can combine those techniques together, either from the hip bump to the cross collar and then vice versa. We want to continue that theme of offense this week by covering a couple other submissions that we can utilize from the closed guard. Remember, our goal is that we want to develop a dangerous guard. We want to develop a guard that when we have that position on someone, they should immediately feel threatened. They should immediately feel like they're in danger, which is hopefully the case. All right, so tonight we're going to be focusing on another submission. Tonight we're going to be working on the Kimura. Now the Kimura is a very powerful submission. I'll explain how this works and then I'll explain the name behind it in a moment, but I'd like to demonstrate it first. All right guys, so let's start by just working that closed guard pull. I'll demonstrate here with Coach. Here we go. So the Kimura is a bent arm lock. Now, we've seen arm locks before. Specifically, we've done our Americana and then the arm bar. The Americana is also a bent arm lock, and the Americana is a technique that we generally do from top positions. The difference between the Americana and the Kimura, for those of you who are curious, is the orientation of the shoulder and the arm. In the Americana, the arm is located up near the head. In the Kimura, the arm is going to be located by the hip. Now, let's talk about the actual Kimura. The Kimura itself is first of all, a position that we can use to control our opponent. It involves a lot of internal rotation of our opponent's shoulder. We're creating what we call a ratchet lever, which is one lever which controls another lever. Okay? So with that ratchet lever, I can control my opponent's body and their posture, but we can also use it as a submission as well. We're going to talk more about the mechanics here in a second, but the name, for those of you who are confused, Kimura is actually someone's name. It's a man. His name was Masahiko Kimura. He was a Japanese Jiu Jitsu world champion, and he used this technique to dislocate the shoulder of Helio Gracie, and so that's why this is now called the Kimura in honor of him. So let's talk about using that Kimura. Now we're going to look at it kind of like what we did with the hip bump sweep. We're going to look at it first in just a mechanical context first. So that means we're going to look at it in kind of a way that it shouldn't work, just so that we have a chance to understand how the actual mechanics of the motion are done. And then we're going to talk about a way that we can set it up. So let's start from the top, guys. We utilize our closed guard pull. Okay, so again, I'm facing my opponent here. I get my double collar grips. We're head to head. My knees are bent. I'm in a good athletic stance. I'm going to start to step up and frame as I pull. And now we're in our closed guard. So once I have my closed guard position, our opponent can tend to make a critical error, and that error is where he puts his hands down on the mat. When my opponent's hands are down on the mat like this, it's going to enable me to attack the Kimura. Now, we always preach to you guys that we need to keep our hands on our opponent when we're inside of their closed guard, and this is why, because the Kimura is a very dangerous technique. So, for the Kimura itself, I'm going to start by choosing the side that I want to attack. All right, it's totally up to you. You can do either or. All right, I'm going to go to my right side here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my right hand to grab his his wrist. But notice how I slightly remove my body, meaning I'm pulling my shoulders away from that side. So that way it's going to be easier for me to get up onto my elbow here. If we rotate 90 degrees, you can again see how as I'm moving down for his wrist, I'm subtracting my body. Now from here, I'm going to create a strong wrist grip as I roll up onto my elbow. This should already start to look familiar. Last week, we worked on our hip bump sweep, which saw us doing a very similar thing of sitting up into the closed guard position. But now, tonight, we're going to attack the Kimura. So I'm going to maintain a strong wrist grip here with my right hand. I'm now going to take my left arm, and I'm going to reach over and then under his arm. So I'm kind of weaving my arm around his. Again, I'm reaching over and under. Look at how close my chest is to his. If you're having difficulty getting that grip, you're probably too far away. See, if I'm too far away, there's no way I'm going to be able to grab. So I come up nice and high. My chest should be touching his shoulder. Now again, I go over, under, and now I grab my wrist. So I'm holding two wrists. His wrist with my right hand, my wrist with my left hand. Now, from this position, I'm going to start to pull myself back to my back. As I do that, I'm going to start to access this lever to his shoulder to create internal rotation to keep his posture broken. That means I want his shoulder to turn in like this. So as I start to lay onto my back, I'm going to pull his elbow towards me as I bend his arm towards his feet. So this is what we call the Kimura position. From here, I have a lot of control over my opponent's posture because I have that internal rotation mechanic. Now, from this spot, I'm going to start to push his arm back behind his back. However, there's a couple nuances that we want to make sure we're clear on. Once I'm in this position here, in order to help me maintain a stronger range of motion, I'm going to start to pull his elbow and connect it to my sternum. Because the only thing that I really want to push is his forearm. I don't really want to manipulate his bicep too much, right? I want to keep that part stationary. So from this position, I'm going to start to slightly switch my hip angle out from underneath him. So if you notice from here, my hip angle or my hips are directly pointing up to the sky. And that's fine, but my range of motion is only as far as my arm can extend here. If you go against someone very flexible, this might not be enough to submit them. So watch. I'm going to slightly shift my hip angle to the side. So now my knees are pointing at him. So now once I have this position, my range of motion is way increased. You see how now I can potentially push my arm all the way to his other shoulder. You're not going to need to do that because his shoulder will absolutely tear right before, okay? But what we're going to do once we have this position, I again isolate his elbow, so I'm creating extension of the joint, and now I'm going to create rotation of that joint by not just using my arms. I don't want to rely on muscular strength to attack the submission. I want to use an isometric hold to finish this. So I'm going to keep his elbow close to my body, and now my chest rotates. And that's how we create a stronger Kimura. So if we go back to the beginning, I've pulled my opponent into the closed guard. First things first. Again, our opponent is making a big error here. This is not necessarily how our opponents are always going to be, right? But just for the sake of understanding the mechanics, this is where we'll start. I'm going to control one side, slightly remove my hips as I sit up. Notice when I sit up, I'm coming up as high as I can with my elbow coming over. I'm now going to go over his elbow, under, and grab my wrist. Now from here, as I start to pull us back, I'm going to bring his elbow to my chest. Notice how I've already started to switch my hip angle so that my knees are pointing at him. I close my guard strong. I create extension of the joint, meaning I'm trying to keep everything taut. I don't want any looseness in the arm, so I'm creating everything nice and strong and tight here. I'm squeezing my grips hard, and now I create an isometric hold, and I use my chest to perform the break. I'm going to show it one more time, slow motion, and then we'll get to it, okay? I'll do it from the other side. So how about we go this way? Okay, so super slow motion, guys. So I'm here, I pull. This, again, is a very powerful submission. Okay, we're attacking the rotator cuff. If we apply this hard and fast, we call that a crank. If we crank this submission, you will absolutely injure your opponent's shoulder. So at no point do we crank Kimuras in this academy or any submissions, but specifically with the Kimura, it is very dangerous. So we can set everything up fast, but then we perform the actual breaking mechanics slowly to give our partner time to tap. Does anybody have any questions on the Kimura? Let's try our basic mechanics here first, and then we'll do some setups for it, okay? Let's go 1, 2. So does anybody have any questions on just the pure mechanical aspects of the Kimura? I'd like to touch on a couple little common errors I was noticing, but then we're going to talk about a way that we can set this up by dealing with a common problem that a lot of white belts can tend to get frustrated with. But first things first, guys, a couple of the common things that I was noticing. So starting here in the closed guard, our closed guard pull is looking good. When I'm in this position, guys, remember, if you're having trouble sitting up, it's probably because your arm is too bent. You see how my arm is awkwardly bent here? Remember, I want to move myself away from the side that I'm going towards. So that way I'm rolling my body as opposed to trying to awkwardly come up onto a strangely bent elbow. So again, I remove my body and then come up and over. Notice how I keep a closed guard this whole time. You never actually have to open your guard, all right? Obviously, if you're having trouble maybe with that sit-up portion, you can open your guard to help you sit up, but then reclose it. Because I never want to give my opponent an opportunity to start passing, so I'm going to keep that guard closed as often as I can. Now again, I get the grip. Everything was looking good here. Nobody asked me this, and that's okay, because I'm going to talk about it anyways. What kind of grip do we use? So in case you're unfamiliar, there's two main grips. We have a C grip and then we have a hook grip. The Kimura, you can do either or. So here I'm using a hook grip, meaning my thumbs are hooking over top of his wrists. Here I'm using a C grip. Honestly, the answer is it doesn't really matter which one you use in this context. Personally, I like to actually use a C grip with the wrist grip that I'm using to push because I find that this is a stronger position to push something than this. That's just personal preference though, right? If you find yourself using the hook grip, this is also very strong, all right? Feel it out, whichever one you think works best. Now, once I'm here, I want to make sure that I create a tight bend in that elbow. So again, I'm trying to pull his elbow back towards me. I'm separating his structure, meaning I'm pulling his elbow away from his body. If his elbow is close to his body, it's going to be easier for him to maintain a strong structure and a tight arm. So I want to pull it away from his body here. Now, once I'm in this position, if your opponent's arm is starting to go straight, we're going to try to focus on using the wrist grip here to bend it back down. So what I'm doing is I'm using my forearm and wrist area as a fulcrum to help me bend his elbow here. So if his arm is starting to go straight, I'm going to bend it back down. Now in this position, guys, I want to create a really strong range of motion. Again, most of us just sat here with our guard closed and we started to push. Again, it'll work against someone who's not actively defending, but I want to create a stronger position. So look, if I need to, I can open up my guard and help by turning my hips out. You see how now I'm actually on my side and I'm leaning towards my opponent. I should be able to look at his head now. Because of this, my range of motion is far increased. My push is now going to go into a much more dangerous angle for his shoulder, as opposed to here, where my push just goes straight up to the sky. Not quite as strong. So look, I adjust my hip angle, keep that elbow close to my ribs, and now I create that isometric tension and slowly rotate. Okay, guys, so just a few mechanical things that I think we can start to improve upon, and it's going to make your Kimura way stronger. But now let's talk about a very common issue that a lot of white belts run into when we're playing closed guard. Okay, and you'll see why this is dealing with the Kimura here in a second. A lot of white belts face this problem. You have someone in your closed guard, and maybe they're frustrated because you have a good closed guard. So what do they tend to do? They tend to dive in and hug your head. This can be really annoying for people who don't know what to do, right? Because if we'd like to use the phrase, he's taken his ball and gone home. He doesn't want to play jiu-jitsu anymore. He wants to just sit here and not lose, so he's just going to dive in and hug my head. This can be annoying, right? Because I can't really move. I can't really use my legs to push him away. So right now, Coach Seth is doing nothing. So let's be clear, this is not a good or helpful reaction. This is just a stalling reaction. You're wasting your time. So I want to address this position here, and then we're going to talk about how we can actually set up the Kimura from here as well. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate how we're going to free ourselves from this spot and then set up the Kimura. Here we go. So what are we going to do? We're going to use our old friend, the frame. The frame is going to be the way that we create a skeletal structure to help create space between us and our opponent. If he's hugging my head really tight here, again, he's not passing my guard, he's not submitting me, so I need to just stay calm. I still have my guard closed around his body, so just relax. Okay, again, this is not a great spot for him because he's starting to expose different attacks for me, right? So as we move on in our jiu-jitsu journey, we'll start to learn things like how to utilize things like the duck under to start to come behind and take their back, things like this. So again, I don't want to get frustrated. I don't want to get emotional here and start flailing around. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a frame. Now, notice how one arm is trapped under his and the other arm is free. I'm going to take my free arm and I'm going to frame it right underneath his chin. Now, I'm going to reinforce this frame with my own hand. So I'm grabbing my wrist here. Now I'm going to start to push this away, which is going to drive him off of me. I'm creating space. As soon as I create space, I'm going to circle my arms to an inside position. So now my limbs are in between his limbs. Now, because I've done this, the tendency is for their hands to touch the floor. Because he was so overly extended forward, as I push him away, he needs to catch his base by putting his hands on the mat. So once he does that, we simply subtract our hips, sit up, and catch the Kimura. Now, I'll show this in a side view in a moment, but I just want to address one quick note. with this particular frame setup, you have to, if need be a little bit mean. If he just wants to keep his head buried in my shoulder here and just squeeze me and hug me as hard as he can, I am going to put this frame under his neck, whether he likes it or not. So what does that mean? I am going to grind this hand across his face so that way I can put my frame in his neck. Now, does that feel good for the top person? Absolutely not. That's the point. I'm not hitting him, I'm not striking him, but I am going to put the frame where I need it to be. It's up to him to keep himself safe. So if it's that uncomfortable, then he should move, right? He should adjust himself. But again, we're assuming that our opponent, they're just shutting down here. So whatever I need to do, I'm gonna get that frame right in front of his face. Again, I reinforce and I start to create this gap between the two of us. Now look, as soon as I create that space, my arms swim inside and now his hands are on the mat. I'm just using my forearms to frame on his elbows here. Now, once I'm in this position, I choose my side, I sit up, and now I start to finish. Okay, let's see that from a side view. So we'll start the same way with the guard pull, but then they kind of dive in and hug your head. All right, so from here, I bring the frame in front of his face, I reinforce, and I start to drive him off. I swim my hands in, grab, and sit up. Notice I'm going to start to slide my hips out, create that extension of the joint, and then we create the rotation of the joint. All joint locks in Jiu Jitsu follow that concept. We create extension and then rotation of the joint. Okay, guys? So I'll show one more time from the top with the guard pull, slow motion. Here we go. Okay, guys, so again, I just wanted to address that common error, or not error, but that common annoyance that some white belts tend to deal with when you're playing closed guard, and then we connected it with the Kimura we just learned. Okay, does anybody have any questions? All right, guys, let's try this out. Be nice, obviously, don't, smash their face too hard, but do what you gotta do. Let's go, 1, 2. Hey, guys, does anybody have any questions on that setup to our Kimura that we worked on? So I hope you guys understand the frames are always going to be an important thing that we need to create. If we're feeling smashed and compacted, we need to create frames to build space. The other thing that is very important here is that concept of inside positioning. Inside position is something that we're always striving to attain in Jiu Jitsu. I want my limbs in between my opponent's limbs, if possible. Okay, whether it's referring to their arms, I want my arms between their arms. If they're legs, I want my legs in between their legs. Because with inside position, we gain better lever control. So we're always looking to create inside position so we can set up our attacks. The last thing I'd like to just touch on, and then we're just going to finish up with some more of that drilling, and then we'll get to specific training, is I want to just demonstrate how this submission can combine with some of the other stuff that we've been working on over the last week. So specifically, the hip bump sweep is going to be a great companion piece to the Kimura, because as we saw in the beginning, the sit-up motion is the same between both the hip bump sweep and the Kimura. So let's start with the Kimura. Let's say I'm attacking the Kimura here, and in reaction to this, my opponent fixes their structure and pulls their hand in tight. So they're grabbing maybe like my belt or my waist, and they're grabbing my body here. So now I can't separate their arm from their body, so I can't finish the Kimura. But what can I do? Well, because he's committed his arm to my body, I can trap it, post my feet, and perform my hip bump sweep. That's what we did last Tuesday. So we can attack the Kimura. If our opponent defends it, we can go to the hip bump sweep. What about the opposite though? This one can get a little bit crazy, so check this out. Let's say I'm doing my hip bump sweep, so I'm here, and as I bump him over, he's just too strong. He overpowers my hand grip here, and he posts his arm out. Now, because he's already broken his own structure and separated his arm from his body, all I need to do is go and grab the Kimura, and now I can finish the Kimura. So that's a slightly, not advanced, I don't like the term advanced, but that's just a slightly more, bombastic sort of approach for that technique, right? We really have to kind of go out and get it, but it just demonstrates the sort of symbiotic nature of these techniques. If one doesn't work, I can always try the other one too, right? If I'm attempting that hip bump sweep and they post the hand, then I'll just go and grab that wrist, attack the Kimura from there. okay? So I'll show both of those, and you guys are welcome to practice and try those when we do our last drilling period here. I'll just show both of those one more time. So starting in the closed guard, first I'm going to attack the Kimura. My opponent grabs my body, and go hip bump sweep. Next, I'm attacking the hip bump sweep, and he posts his hand. I reach out and grab the Kimura. When I reach out for that Kimura, I'm kind of doing like a like screwdriver motion. So I'm twisting one way, and then I twist the other way so that I can get my correct hip angle to finish the actual technique. So guys, if you'd like to, play around with these. If you're not familiar with the hip bump sweep, don't worry about it. Just continue to practice that Kimura, and then we'll move into our rolling period. Alrighty guys, let's get to work. 1, 2. Sister Christian, all the time has come, and you know that you're the only one. Alrighty guys.